Hello and welcome to another episode of the Psychosocial Distancing Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Daniel Chadbourne, and with me as always is Thomas Brooks.
Hello, hello.
So today we're going to be getting into talking about prejudice, specifically this distinction between individual and institutional prejudice. And joining us today are two returning special guests from different podcasts, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Natalia Assis, and I'm a PhD student in educational psychology here at Texas A&M Commerce. And yes, and I'm from Brazil, so that's why I have this accent. So hang in there with me.
And I am Katzarska-Miller. I'm associate professor at Transylvania University. And I do teach classes, and in a lot of my classes, this notion of like the systemic nature of oppression and so forth is part of those classes. So that's why I'm here.
And we thank you both for joining us again. So I guess we should start because this idea, whenever we talk about, or at least I'm going to say generally speaking, when social psychologists or individuals who are versed in these topics or maybe trying to converse with people who are not as well versed in these distinctions, there's typically this kind of confounding overlap between the individual and the institution, or the person and the system or society. So I guess we should begin by kind of talking and parsing apart where these distinctions lie.
Sure, I guess I can start. So even in the textbook that you guys are using for social psych, right? When you look at it on the chapter on like the stereotypes or prejudice, there are the three components that I talked about are stereotypes, which is kind of the individual beliefs that we have. Then it's prejudice, which is the attitudes, like the individual beliefs, not beliefs, but feelings that one has towards members of certain groups. And then the discrimination, right, which is the biased acts. And for the longest time, I mean, if you look at social psychological research, that was the focus, focusing on all these processes that are residing in individual minds. Although I would say that in recent years, there's much more awareness about the fact that these things come out of the cultural space that we occupy, right? And that we live in a cultural space, and this is not the only one that exists in every single cultural space, where groups are positioned differently in the social hierarchy, right? And there's this notion of privilege and oppression. So some groups are privileged, others are oppressed. So, for example, in this cultural space, I'll talk about race for a second, and then, I mean, we can open up to talk about other groups as well. Like one of the biggest insults for a white person is to be called racist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
Right, that's correct.
Like, oh my God.
Hard.
Yes,
I'm such a good heart. Yeah.
It's so hard, right? I mean, it's like the worst, the words in insult. And the way we define racism, and there are other psychologists that define it that way, as well as people in sociology, is that racism is advantage based on race, right? So it's talking about how different groups are positioned different in the social hierarchy versus prejudice, which is on individual level, right? The beliefs that a person has towards, not the beliefs, I keep saying beliefs, the feelings that a person has towards different groups. So the argument, for example, is that, for example, as a white woman, and those of us that are white on these podcasts, the majority of us, right?
Yes.
We might not be prejudiced people. We might do not have negative attitudes towards certain groups. But we all, the three of us that are white, we are all racists because we benefit from the system that privileges whiteness,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Right. You're
Right.
already there, right? Mm-hmm.
Right? So
That distinction, I was going to say that distinction kind of, hits with me. I talk about growing up in Southern Louisiana, and there were a lot of things that, thanks to some teachers and some classes I took and more research on it, I think I'm a lot more aware of in terms of the way I think about other groups, or that maybe I thought about other groups in the past. And that distinction, I think, makes a lot clearer is to say that those thoughts that I'm having, but not necessarily enacting upon, or those thoughts that might pop in my head because of previous knowledge or previous exposure to these ideas. Again, isn't necessarily me acting upon any sort of prejudicial, but it is tied to sort of these underlying systems.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Nice.
So it's usually something involving, like, when we talk about racism, it's not like a individual on individual personal attack on one's own morality or their self.
Right.
It's pointing to the
the
fact that one person benefits from the system of power, whereas the other one doesn't.
That's right. That's why, for example, we can argue that, any like a marginalized group, they can be prejudiced, right, towards white people. Like they could be Black people that do not like white people, justifiably so, right? But we cannot argue that they are racist because they're not benefiting from the system.
Right. It's a totally different process. Yes. Yeah, that's so interesting. And what came to my mind right now, it's about how, for example, I'm Black, but I'm Black Brazilian. So I'm Latino Black. So now it's the first time that I see online, they have this movement about the Latin, Black Latin, or Black Latin, something. So they have this movement online, and that's the first time that I see people saying that, because my whole 13 years here was like, no, you're not Black, you're Latina. And I'm like, but you can be both, so like this perception of group, even that shifts depending on the cultural context anyways, right? Yeah.
And kind of this whole idea of race in the first place, isn't that like the history of race is kind of born out of a justification for inequality at the beginning. So this idea, if you go back to like the eugenicists, the Victorian era, that the way that we conceptualize race was purposely constructed in order to justify the systems of power that existed already, as sort of like a narrative that we've all internalized as well.
Yeah, there's a sociologist, Alan Johnson, who argues that whiteness as a category, right, came as a function of capitalism, very much so, in order to be able to, as Thomas, as you pointed out, to justify the inequality system.
Right.
I'll see if I could post a video. He's written a couple of books. Tim Wise gave a speech at, I think it was one of the like education conferences, and talks a lot about some of the history and these kind of interactions and part of these systems. And I think he does, I don't think I could repeat it and do it justice. I think he does a spectacular job and kind of setting up that. But it does make me think, if we're talking about, prejudice as the kind of individual, personal aspect, racism as more of the institutionalized system aspect, we're really sort of fighting and trying to define these terms. If we're operationalizing them, we're kind of fighting against a system that does use them interchangeably, much in the same way that I think we interchange race and ethnicity, or sex and gender, that we're kind of coded them in such a way that it makes it very difficult, because if we say something like, well, we're all racist, but we're not all prejudiced, or there are these systems that influence some of the ways that we think that may cause people to act in a prejudiced manner, or may change their perception that causes a certain level of prejudice, that we kind of conflate the two to a degree that we almost sometimes can't have a discussion parsing the two apart.
Right.
Yeah, no, it kind of defeats the ability to build bridges and communication across groups if we're only talking at each other. So if, one person's trying to make a systematic critique and then the other person is only taking it personally, then there's no way that those two people can interact in a positive way for progressive change within that situation.
Yes, and my impression is that this distinction between racism and prejudice, the way we have been using it, it's a very academic distinction, right? In the real world, racism, being racist and being prejudiced, as Daniel pointed out, it means the same thing.
Right.
Although in academia, we make that distinction.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe we should talk a little bit about this issue of why are people so, white people, why the worst offense is to be called racist, right? Like what is that bringing up to be considered like the worst thing that you can, the worst offense that you can give to a white person. So I mean, in the literature, right, one of the kind of the explanation is that we think that being racist, being prejudiced, it means that you're a bad person. And
Right.
racism has nothing with whether you're a good or a bad person, right? There are plenty of really, really good people that are racist based on our definition because they're benefiting from the system, right? But we perceive it as oh, you are saying something about me as an individual when it has nothing to do about you as an individual.
Right, right. So then you can never say, yes, I am, and let's move on from here now, because now we are, let's fix this. But they're never gonna, not never, right? One day, hopefully we're gonna understand, but they are going to say, no, I'm not. And then you have the press group saying, yes, you are. And they have the other say, no, I'm not. And how do we move from this, right?
It becomes a personal attack, or at least the person takes it as a personal attack instead of maybe viewing the systematic pressures. And to explain that takes time. And if you
And not just for the attacked, right? But whoever is attacking us. So I don't know if we are making that distinction here on the other side either, right? So I think it works together, right?
This kind of reminds me of ACAB. So all cops are bastards. And this idea that particularly right now when we're talking about police reform and should we even have a police force and what the role of the police are in society, that we kind of talk past each other in that way because ACAB represents, or defund the police represents, a systematic change. But when you say like all cops are bastards, like all of the cops and the people whose families have family members who are cops are going to take that very personally as well. And so it doesn't foster a great conversation if we're using different definitions of these concepts in order to communicate them, which makes me feel very stuck. Like, I think this is like a very, the zeitgeist of America is stuck.
No, I really like your example because I think it's very like, I mean, very applicable to what we're trying to talk about, right? That although the words are implicating individuals, the reality is that it refers to the system. Like the police system is messed up, right? That's what needs to be fixed. It doesn't have anything to do with whether the people that participate in it are good or bad people.
Right, right. Not based on those, right?
And that reaction to it, and I think maybe to that it's a little more charged because it does have that, I think, more overtly individual aspect, or at least perception, that you're saying that like all cops, like it's all of these people. But in much of the same way that when we're talking about racist and who is racist, like how comments like Black Lives Matter become very personal to some people, or charged in some way, is that it's viewed as this statement of, but what about all lives? Or there was that hashtag, that not all men hashtag a couple of years ago. That kind of touches on the same thing, where there were people talking about like, we have these issues with masculinity and the way, you know, behaviors are reinforced or allowed when compared to, you know, how they might be seen in different situations. Or we have issues with, you know, toxicity amongst this kind of hyper masculinity. We should maybe do something about that. And instead of saying like maybe there's a problem here, maybe I should, you know, reassess and kind of look at these issues and maybe think about how they're affecting me as a man, and instead saying, no, not all men are like that, I'm one of the good ones. It's not because the issue's about the system. It's about the kind of cultural sphere.
That's a very great point, Daniel. Very great.
And it kind of gets at this idea that when we're in a group, that we kind of perceive ourselves as like the prototypical or the exemplar group member as well. So we project our own lived experience and our own values and our own behavior, whether they're good or bad, onto the groups that we belong to. And so that's why people also get very defensive when you attack their group or make a critique of their group, whether it's fair or not, because it immediately translates to you as an individual as well.
So what do we do about it? We need to solve this problem right
now.
Oh, yes.
we just need experience. Experience with other groups will solve everything. And maybe some racial bias training.
Yeah, so
right?
I mean, are we going to morals right now, or is it just like something later, or is it something that we are doing interchange, like in the middle, entertain?
I guess let's talk about what Thomas brought up. So I mean, on one hand, we have this litany of research that looks at. I'll start by saying the original perspective that looked at aspects of the contact hypothesis, which is this idea if you just bring people together with experience, it'll suddenly solve everything. And
right.
A lot of social scientists thought that was going to work great until desegregation happened, and it didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But we do have other. We have research that to show you need more than that, and so things like interdependence and multiple group contact, equal status, societal norms. A number of factors that can reduce this effect. So maybe contact alone, we have that kind of on one side, and then we also have what tends to be really popular, training. So racial bias training, implicit training, and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems that the implicit bias is kind of the new fad, right? In like what the issues are and how we can solve them. And the implicit bias, again, it makes it's interesting to me because it makes a very individualistic take, right? So we all have these implicit biases, but these implicit biases come from the culture of space that we occupy, right? We are not born necessarily with these implicit biases. But again, this is probably the problem with the training that is being done on implicit bias is like, let's change individuals instead of let's change the system. And I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that I know what the solution is.
Right.
Instead of saying, let's look at the system that causes those implicit biases to begin with.
Mm-hmm. And I agree. I agree with you guys for sure. And what I'm thinking here is like, they do help though, to at least bring some issues to some individuals' minds that they were oblivious to it. Sometimes whenever those trainings, like maybe you will touch points that this white person or whatever, would never even consider. So are the trainings completely just not teaching, or are they teaching, but they are like trying to teach the incomplete action or process, right? Just a piece of it. You see what I mean? Because where would all those people get this information from, if not from those trainings that we are talking about?
So I think I agree with the positive intention and the optimism of the contact of the information. But very often these trainings are not voluntary, and they're not contextualized within a positive space. So usually these happen after a racially charged incident within a workplace.
Or the country, or even, whatever.
Yeah, so like if we take like the corporate route with this, like if, white man John says something to his colleague that's racially insensitive, then the boss is going to implement this racial bias training. And so John is now put on the spot within this context, and he's going to be really bitter about that.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Right.
I unfortunately subjected myself to a bunch of these just because I was curious as to the content of them. And one of them I was going through had this little skit going on where this situation happened. And the resolution after the training, like the boss of the group of workers was like, well, we're going to have a workplace lunch in our break room. And as a reward for doing so great on your implicit bias training, I've put a framed poster in the break room that says that, represents trust. And then in each of your offices, there are framed motivational posters. So that way you can hang them up and think of diversity and inclusion. That was how it ended. That was exactly how it ended. And I was like, wait, so John messes up at work, and then everybody goes through racial bias training, and then as a reward you get motivational posters? Is this what this is?
to remind you of this training that you didn't even ask for you to come anyways.
Yeah, and I think of the issues like power as well. Like all of the employees are in a lower power station than the boss, who is ultimately responsible for the cultural climate of the workforce to begin with.
True.
And so if anyone should be having like mandatory racial bias training, it should be the bosses.
Agreed, totally agree.
Yeah, and I don't think that any of us, just to make clear, is saying that there should not be workshops or conversations.
Yeah.
Right? No, none of us are saying.
Right. That's why I wanted to clarify. Yes.
Yeah. To Natalia's point, Natalia, I totally agree with you that yes, there is an opportunity for people to learn, but here's I think the key is that a lot of people do not think that they have those biases. They do not think that they do not right.
They're not identifying with this training being taught here, because I'm not racist.
Yes, and there's also this resistance, right? And this I mean, the term that is being used a lot nowadays is white fragility, right? White people do not like to feel uncomfortable when the issue of race is being brought up. And usually that will lead to like people shutting down or removing themselves from the situation, or, you know, making themselves the victim. Like, how dare you make me uncomfortable right now? I'm a good white woman, and you're telling me that, you know, biases, oh, let me cry, it's all about me, I'm the victim here, you know. So there are just so many like obstacles to people being willing or not even defensive to stop for a second and consider that that could be existing and that they can be perpetuating and be part of these systems.
I see.
And I will say, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the idea with the implicit bias training is ultimately, at least what we talk about academically, is tied to those social factors that if you put anyone in front of an implicit association test, what we expect to see is that they show implicit bias towards typically majority groups. My favorite to demonstrate to my students is the Chicago Shoot No Shoot study, where even amongst minority participants, they still make more incorrect errors, make more quick judgments in sort of shooting this particular suspect. They make more mistakes if it's a non-white versus a white suspect. And that doesn't say that the person is prejudiced, but it says that there are these systematic pressures that have an influence on it.
Right.
And
yes, but if you look at like the original, like the IIT came about, what, 95, I think. Even if you listen to how the researchers like Greenwald and Banaji talk about it, they talk about it as this is a sign of implicit prejudice, right? And I think that probably nowadays that is not necessarily the language that is being used, but that's how in social psychology, because of the focus is so much on the individual, that's how it has been conceptualized.
So are we talking about, for example, we were talking about we need more than contact, right? So what comes to my mind is the morals, because then we're talking about like some of you guys right now listed some of the things that are needed. I think it was Daniel, for this let's put not segregation, the opposite.
Desegregation?
Yes, desegregation to work. You need more than just the contact. So I'm thinking are we, and I guess this is one, it's an open question. Are we talking about, what are we talking about actually? You know?
Like in terms of how do we overcome this?
Yes, exactly. So like, for example, we were talking about morals. Okay, I'm back now.
Welcome back.
So we have to have like similar morals, right? Similar ideals, similar, like, so I guess what I'm asking is, what are the things that we need in order for this mingle that we're talking about, the contact to work, or it's not even that? So what is it that we're talking about? Of course, I'm not saying let's solve all the problems on the word, right? But it's, where are we going then? Like from here, for example.
Sharif, the Robbers Cave experiment.
Do you know that there were so many issues with that study? And you know that he did it first, not the one that we always talk about. He did it and it did not work at all. And with this one that we all talk about, he actually, he used to drink a lot, and he would drink in the evening, and he would yell at his graduate students. There was one case in which a graduate student said to him, "Sir, put down whatever, I think it was, what is that called? A brick. Put down the brick because I'm going to hit you back." And he was screaming and yelling at them because he wanted to get the results that he wanted to get. So like the way it was implemented or the way the study was done, there are a lot of issues there.
That's our next Zimbardo discussion, is we're gonna
right,
deconstruct the Sharif.
Yep.
Yeah, the research, I guess, that follows that.
Yes.
Yes. Let's do that. Yes.
Yeah, it does get into, and most of the social psych texts will at least, talk about ways to reduce some of these. And this is, again, I think mostly prejudice. This is the individual side, maybe rather than the systemic side. Though there are aspects, so they do mention social norms. So like you talked about morality as an aspect, and we'll get to moral foundations. It's on the list. That those are in part tied to systematic aspects. You can have two groups who have very different outlooks in terms of morality and what is acceptable and unacceptable. But yeah, if you look at desegregation as an example, you have these students who are suddenly brought into an all-white school. They are historically from far less funded, generations-old textbooks. You have a lot of other issues in terms of, so I mean, imagine having someone who has a first grade level basically being brought into a fourth grade class and expected to suddenly make contact. So we have these natural disparities within the system of how these individuals were being taught, what information they got, what resources they got. We have societal norms that are saying, well, yeah, you can go to that school, but you can't go to the same restaurant, or you can't drink from the same water fountain. So there are these further systemic aspects. But other aspects, they look at things like repeated intergroup context. So it's not just meeting that one person. It's not just having that one experience.
Right. You have to have variety, right? So you can actually create a solid opinion about these people here too.
Right. Because if you're the only Brazilian I know, Natalia, then you shape my view of Brazilians. And if I have a stereotype about what Brazilians are like, and you don't fit that stereotype, I can go, you're an exception to the rule.
Yeah. Definitely.
And so by meeting more and more Brazilians or people of other groups, or exposing myself to more and more of that culture, it helps to break down. It helps to reshape part of it, I think.
Yeah.
The other big thing that I that always took away from that was that equal status aspect, that, having two employees working together on the same level, you can see a breakdown in some of this prejudice. But if you're trying to remove the prejudice at the corporate level, at the boss's level, that boss, that manager, isn't going to suddenly become non-prejudiced because they have a minority employee.
Right. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, there is so in social psychology, right, there is a lot of studies that are looking at prejudice reduction on individual level, and there's a paper that I don't know if it's out yet or it's coming out. It's in the annual review of psychology that looks at a review, right, of all strategies that are proposed for prejudice reduction, and it shows that empirically there are some strategies, but we don't know, like they're taking place in a particular context, and we don't know whether they have any kind of long-term effects. So,
I mean, it's like that same idea that we were talking about with the implicit training is that it can work on some people, but you kind of have to already maybe be open to it working, or you have to be in maybe a situation where your boss isn't making you do it, but you're maybe deciding to want to know more. And maybe at that point, you're probably not maybe as in need of something like a prejudice training because I mean they're the systematic pressures, but we're talking about it if you're already open and wanting to maybe improve your relations with other people to some extent. I think over the summer we did a faculty book reading, and it was very much driven by us. We decided we wanted to do it. We kind of all volunteered to do it. We read through Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and we had discussions about it, but talked about it from that kind of systematic. I mean, there was much more, at least, discussion on the kind of systematic approaches and maybe the way certain policies were written at the academic level. But it was definitely something we wanted to do. It wasn't something that we were being forced to do.
It brings me, what it brings to my mind is this book, I think it's called Values in Action. And it's this lady and she happens to be white. I talked to her, she's so great. I was watching her training and she was so spot on that I emailed her after. I'm like, because at first I was like, ooh, what is she gonna say? Let's see. There's always some little thing. But her book, it's talk about how you could teach your how to teach your students to be activists. But then what she talks about is actually like this context, like you give, so it's context and then learning, like, so learn the stuff and then context, like you go and do a service project about something. Doesn't need to be service, but you do like get involved in it. So first you get the learning. I believe that's the order. You gotta get the knowledge, and then, no, first you get the context, and you have to feel it, so the professor can, show cultural things or context or something. But in a context, I know that I kept saying context, but what she's trying to say is, you don't just say, let's go tomorrow to a protest. That's not how it's gonna work. To a student, for example, like, I really want my students to understand this better. So let's go to the protest. And then they are like, it's like the training, they're like, I don't have any context here. I don't like this and I'm rejecting this. So it's about creating this context in which the person sees themselves, right, inside of this context and not just as, how do you say, isolated from it, So she talks about that, about creating this mindset. I think that it's the openness. I think, Daniel, instead of just coming with the training, you have to create that openness of the mind first. I think
like a willingness for perspective taking, empathy.
Well, empathy, right? There are some issues with empathy, but that's a different conversation. To Daniel's point, I think one thing that we need to accept is that for those of us that belong to privileged groups is that like for the rest of our lives, we will unlearn. And reading one book, being part of one workshop, we're not like, you get a glimpse, but you're not any necessarily, like, it's not like suddenly you are free of bias, you are free of everything, right? It's a lifelong like a learning path, or unlearning what we have been taught path, if that makes sense.
And I think to Natalia's point, what kind of gave me hope with the previous rendition of the Black Lives Matter movement this year is that a lot of the poor white, like kind of that empathy connection, seeing yourself in other people's struggle, was that a lot of my poor white friends and a lot of the posts that were coming around from this lower economic group was a lot of anti-police sentiment as well. And so they were much more willing to have the conversation with Black Lives Matter and about Black Lives Matter this time around, because they grew up in a situation where, like, in small white towns, like, the police are terrible. They set up speed traps, they purposely put drugs on people to get them arrested. And so there's a lot of anti-authoritarian sentiment in these lower income white groups that was able to kind of bridge that gap and have those conversations with this edition of Black Lives Matter that wasn't present a few years back.
Although Thomas, you're saying something that I think I hear that, not what you said, but in general, many people will say, well, some people will say, and I will not name names, right? That's the rule of the podcast that I just made up. But
it's a good rule. It's a good
rule.
This is it. We're holding up to this.
Eva's law. We don't name names.
People will say, well, it's about socioeconomic status. It's not about race. And that's a very problematic. Yes, we should have the conversations about socioeconomic status as well, but that does not trump race.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That
Correct.
makes sense, right? And oftentimes it is used as an excuse of not to deal with the racial inequalities that exist in this country and in other cultural spaces.
And I think,
go ahead.
Oh, on a complementary note, I think it's also important to include that it's a necessity to include that socioeconomic class difference as well, because that is a commonality between poor white people and Black people, that there are some shared experiences with authority that you can build those bridges with, but it can't be one or the other. It has to be both. And I think that's where implicit bias training misses the mark, is that it's only the race and it doesn't incorporate the fact that all of these people are sharing a class of being employees within this system as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think that probably leads us to kind of the notion of intersectionality, but I would argue that the experience of a poor white person is very different than the experience of a poor Black person.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
I wanted to ask.
I'm not saying they're the same. I'm saying there's more connections there to be made.
Commonalities.
Yeah, that you can
Right.
have better conversation if you talk
I was
in
just trying
class.
to lead us into the next topic.
I do want to ask one question, because I think it kind of ties in and will eventually get us to intersectionality, because that is that aspect of how we can look at these combinations of groups and sort of these differences and similarities depending on aspects that are shared and aren't. But kind of tied into what Eva said regarding that it is kind of a lifelong process, that this isn't something that you have to again do one. I think social psychology and trying to delve into it has helped me kind of on that path, starting to realize, all right, like there are these biases, there are these systems in place, there's these thoughts that I might have had in high school, there's these things that I might have said or accepted in high school compared to today. And it is definitely this consistently moving process of wanting to keep up with understanding, wanting to gain more perspective, wanting to put myself in check. But it also kind of ties to what Thomas said, that it made me think that in a lot of these cases, especially with something like the Black Lives Matter movement being maybe far more accepted amongst groups, especially compared to its beginning. I mean, we look at national acceptance of the movement is far higher than it's ever been.
Yeah.
Could part of that less be about just that perspective taking and saying, like, I grew up in a low-class situation, so I kind of understand some of the aspects of dealing with the police, and maybe even just more to the aspect of time. We're also in this same moment where a lot of people were suddenly not working. They were at home, and that ultimately it became kind of a perfect storm with their ability to pay attention to some of this stuff, because this again gets into this part of, if it's a lifelong process, you have to also have the ability to devote time to it, to pay attention to it, and to, it's not just read one book, but keep up and read more or engage more. That if maybe some aspect of almost being in a situation where, well, I'm kind of stuck at home, I maybe, paying attention to the news more might have had something, or maybe it is an aspect of this perspective. Maybe it's a mix of both. I mean, it's a complex question, but it's something that I've thought of in relation to this higher acceptance of Black Lives Matter now, as opposed to,
Right. Yes, I see what you're saying, and I think this is going to complement what you're saying, but not just necessarily like, oh, because I had time, I would do it, but I think it's this better consciousness of humans, like in general, to see others. It's like, oh, look, they have been talking about this for 30 years at least, that I know, I think that people are finally trying to at least, recognize the human in all of us. And I think that's when it's like, it's over. Let's stop this. Everybody stop this.
There's definitely this disconnect, because we're not really talking about the person in the situation. we're talking about kind of a recognition of the systematic in injustices or the systems in place, which seemed, I mean, I would maybe argue that that might be what we're seeing in this case, as opposed to what 2014, when it was mostly focused.
Oh, sorry, Daniel.
Go ahead.
A more pessimistic view. I mean, think about it. Like Daniel, what you were saying, it makes sense. On the other hand, I would argue that if you're home without a job, you will be your first priority. You will have to figure it out to support your family. I don't have time to worry about those other people and what they're going through, because right now I have to take care of me. And I actually think that with the pandemic and everything going on, I think that this racial divide will become much more extreme, and there will be much more lack of understanding. And not because, as Natalia was pointing out, people don't want to be good humans and relate, but because people are suffering, people are hurting, and just the notion of privileged identity, right? It's that whole notion is that right now I need to take care of myself and I need to take care of my family, and I do not have the time or the cognitive energy to worry about others.
Right.
And I hope I'm wrong. I mean, that's just purely speculative on my part. I hope that that's not the case.
It's that aspect of realistic conflict theory, that if there's some real conflict, and if your conflict is like, I need a job and I will fight for anyone else because my family comes first, that would come into play. So, I mean, maybe an interesting shift if we look at things like the stimulus at the beginning versus now, and looking at maybe a shift from then to now, and maybe some of those views as to saying that, you know, if you're worried about a job, but you've also got this money that you've been given that allows you to kind of stay afloat for a little bit.
Right.
Maybe that could help mediate some of that issue. But now, because it's all gone.
Yeah. I mean, I think two aspects to the increased popularity is one, that Black Lives Matter has been consistent. And there's been repeated exposure for people.
Right.
So like, I remember when Ferguson happened, that was kind of my like wake up moment as a white person. And then ever since then, in each iteration of Black Lives Matter, it's maintained its consistency and its message and its systematic critique. And so that's only increased my support. But also, kind of to the point of the pandemic as well, is that I feel like there's been more of an anti-authoritarian streak this year that hasn't been, because we've been watching. So like Daniel brought up the stimulus bills, like it's an open secret that everybody knows that the money went to the top. Like, regardless of your political orientation, we all know that poor people are getting screwed above rich people. So that might also be a part of it, that you can now relate to a larger group of shared suffrage that you wouldn't have been able to before the pandemic when you lost your job.
Good point.
And so like when the bottom falls out and the white people are uncomfortable, they've got to figure out why.
So this takes us to intersectionality.
Yes.
Somehow. Yeah, class, race, gender, everything in between, sexual orientation, this intersectionality, and how combinations of stigmatized communities change personal experience, systematic experience. I mean, into how the system interacts with you, how you interact with the system, how other people interact with you.
No, I was just going to say that unfortunately, the mainstream methodology that we use in social psychology is not easy to do intersectional research, right? So in social psych, usually we look at additive effects. So you have like 2 by 2, gender by race, right? And it's an additive, it's not an intersectional effect. And I know there are some articles out there for anybody interested that can read up on, you know, like how can we ask the questions in a different way, and also maybe how we can try to adopt existing methodologies, or even be like, for example, qualitative methods, right, which is underutilized in social psych, and it has a relatively bad rap. We don't see it because it's like something that humanities do or sociology do or whatever does. They're much more likely to show the effects of intersectionality than the purely quantitative methods that we use, which is unfortunate. Yeah. but there, I do think that there are not in the mainstream, but there is more and more research that is trying to take intersectional approach.
Do you have an example that you could bring? Just kind of like what's the best that we're getting right now with the intersectional approach within social psych?
Well, so again, and I'm basing that on just, doing reviews for conferences and whatnot, a lot of, and seeing some papers about that, a lot of the things is still, to some extent, probably not the way the theorizers of intersectionality conceptualize it. So for example, you might do a study on Black women experiences in regard to something, or, gay men experiences gay white men experiences in regard to something. If that
So like specifying the group that
Yes.
you were studying and naming them.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
It would be very difficult to do. I mean, if you were going to do a comparison group, you couldn't do that 2 by 2. You would have to do, each one of these would be their own separate group, would take a lot of participants, a lot of asking the right questions, trying not to.
Yes, and I wonder sometimes, I think about it. So, the big categories when we talk about intersectionality right now, as Daniel pointed out, it's race, it's gender, it's sexuality, socioeconomic status. But you can break it down more. You can look at disability, you can look at age and so forth. And I feel like sometimes, right, I think about it like, can we talk about an average person? Can we do the conclusions that we do inside? Because when you break it down, everybody's unique, right? They have a unique combination.
The human, yeah, like the unique individual. If you, right. That's your point.
No, it's something that I'm constantly conscious of when I'm doing any sort of sex research, particularly with the psychology pool, because like we could look at like the rural urban divide within like A&M Commerce, because like half the student population is from like small towns around the area and the other half are transplants from Dallas. There's a racial divide, the gender divide, it's like 80% women in our pool. Very small sexual orientation differences. And so like I always struggle because kind of my theoretical framework for studying sex is the sexual scripts. And so like it specifies that you need to take into consideration the cultural and the gender context of sexuality. And I'm like, what kind of conclusion can I make here with this random assortment of 80% women? And trying to figure out how to like actually specify research questions that meet the participant pool that I have is very difficult, rather than doing overarching like this is what humans do research and then like 80% women.
Yeah,
it's very hard.
It is.
I'm thinking with the intersectional aspects of this is that how, I'm not sure how easy would be, but how to put this into the kind of individual versus institutional, because we're also looking at how these individuals and the combinations, and again, how visible those combinations are, how easy it might be to sort of hide aspects of, especially if we're talking about, maybe someone in a rural versus an urban area and their ability to disclose or conceal their sexual orientation. And then how that, because there are aspects that do work on the sort of individual level when we talk about kind of direct prejudice, direct interactions with certain people in their environment, which can also drastically change if you grow up in a small rural area versus a larger city, but also the kind of institutional intersectionality, because these institutional pressures that are affecting someone who is, let's say, Hispanic versus someone who is Hispanic and a member of the LGBT community, they're going to have this kind of double layer of institutional pressures, at least if I'm kind of understanding the way all of these sort of intersections work.
Right. Oh yeah. And then you become a separate group, right? And I think that's what I understood from what you were saying, Daniel, when you're like, you had to separate the groups, right? So like, that's why it's hard to make the intersectionality, right? Because what group are you going to put me if you're doing I don't know if you're comparing race.
Mhm.
You're gonna put me on the Latino or on the Black, or are you talking about African American? Or like I had Black experiences in Brazil, you know, so that, I mean, I'm the example of intersectionality, right? Because I mean, I'm like right there in the middle of everything. So you see what I mean?
Yeah, because you wouldn't be able to neatly fall into a category of an intersectional paradigm to begin with.
So unless I choose one, right? So then like, okay, we're going to include, I'm going to be Latina in this, I don't know, in this study, let's say, that they are studying the Latino experience, right? But then when they're studying the Black experience, am I there? But I think that's a lot of, the whole world does that, but it's very, you can contrast it here because of the whole history, you know? So we have that in Brazil, for example, but it's just not that explicit. Let's put it like that. Yeah.
Natalia, I really like what you're bringing up, and that goes to your previous point about the woman who you talked about this notion of context, right? That your intersectional identities can vary as a function of the context.
Right, exactly. And I think about that, and also like how we draw the identities, right? Like, for example, I thought about this when we introduce ourselves. The first thing, I always say I'm Brazilian. So I draw this identity from this a lot. But then, for example, I was in a webinar the other day, and they're talking about names and how people say names wrong. And people were saying that they get very offended. And I do not draw any identity, I guess, from my name. I mean, a little bit, because I'm Natalia, right? But it doesn't offend me. But in Brazil, people already change your name immediately. So if it's like Thomas, and the next time they see you, they say Tom. Without, it's not something they had to like give a permission to be changed. It's already, it's how you're showing affection, right? So then I don't mind if people say my name in any kind of way. But we were talking about Latinos, and you know how Brazil is totally different, and we have Portuguese, and those things are so different that whenever you put me in the group of Latinos, I'm like, who are we talking about? Exactly. Latinos like what? Like, right? Because yes, we are from Latin America, but we don't even speak the same language. And we all know that when you don't speak the same language, there's so many other things that came from other things, right? So that's how hard I think it gets, in the sense that I'm not even mixed. You see, it's not like I'm a mixed person. I'm just Black. But whenever I come here, all of these things come to contrast. Yeah.
One of the things that you told me a while back is that America is hyper segregated in its identities and its groups, like just down to like friend groups.
Correct. Down to the movies, when you're watching it and people sitting in the grass, you have the punks, you have the athletes, you have the, so it's portrayed in the culture, like we were talking about, as groups that are separate, even whenever it's not even the plot, right? That's not what I'm trying to convey here, but that's exactly how they have in the movies, right?
And so like there's kind of this hyper fixation on groups and group identities here and boxes.
Where I'm gonna fit.
Whereas in Brazil, that's not the case.
No, but you can't, right? I mean, you do have it, don't get me wrong, and we have racism, we have colorism, we have all of those things. However, you have so many colors in the middle, in between, because of mixing and all this stuff, that the lines are not that, they're hard, right? Like they're not that, how do you say it?
Crisp.
Yeah, that crisp, sharp, yeah. Right.
Maybe I want to get your perspective, Eva, on this. Is that would something like this aspect of intersectionality make it maybe more difficult to discuss some of the institutionalized aspects because of these almost individual combinations, so that you could have someone who would be easy to throw forward if you're trying to promote maybe keeping this certain institution, to throw forward and say, hey, look, I'm a member of this group. I'm not marginalized. I'm successful. These other people aren't successful, because, you know, maybe if you're taking into account some of those things like class and race and a number of other factors, that it may make it, because we tend to think about I mean, one, I guess, because we tend to think about this individually, it does make it very difficult. But when you start adding this complexity of intersectionality on one hand, it can aid in that perspective taking, but also make it really difficult on that trying to tear down some of those institutional systems?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I'm sure that this will be something I'll be pondering for a while. No, seriously, like I've never thought about that, but it's a fascinating question. And I would say right now, and again, maybe a month from now, I'll have a completely different answer. But as of right now, I would argue that in terms of intersectionality, at least the way people approach it right now in the literature and so forth, it's on the individual level again, right? So, and if we look at our society, right, it is racist, it is sexist, it's homophobic. Homophobia, by the way, it's the wrong word to use. It's heteronormative, that's a better word. And when we look at society, it's a combination of all those things, right? Our institutions are all of that. Right. At the same time, like they intersectional in that way as well. But I see your point of like, so how can we combat these institutions if we realize that is taking a place?
Yeah.
I mean, if it was easy, we would have solved it by
right.
now. Right?
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I just kind of looked to you as the expert in the room.
Oh no. No, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, but I think that it's philosophically speaking, but it is the key is that diversity is the key, right? So, but how do you do that or get there if people are not even recognizing that they are from the same group, right? Because like we just said, it goes down to the level of the individual. Like there is no individual that is the same. So the rule is that nobody's the same, right? But then where is the line, right? That who are we putting in this category here? Who are putting in that category here? But like based on which of those influences that we're talking about.
Yeah, but at the same time, I would argue on institutional level. So if we look at the world around us, and probably that's the easiest example, it's like the world around us is not built for people with disabilities. If I'm in a wheelchair, oh, my life will be very, very difficult, right? Yeah. Regardless of whether I am a Black lesbian woman in a wheelchair, right? It seems that there are these institutional barriers. Like, it seems to me, I don't know, Daniel, I need to think more about it, but it seems to me that this intersectional approach doesn't necessarily translate to the systemic level, or maybe it does, but I don't know how to explain it. But like for each of these, right, like if you are disabled, there are barriers. If you're Black, there are barriers. If you're woman, there are barriers, and it's like a cumulative maybe effect.
And there does, and maybe the intersection comes with like what you mentioned, that we have this heteronormative, racist, sexist, I mean, to an extent classist, you know, that there are certain people, to an extent, classist.
100% around
pretty big one. But that a lot of these forces that kind of work to promote institutions that affect one of those groups likely also affect the others. And that even if we're looking, so there might be differences in what someone who is in a wheelchair versus someone who is a member of the LGBTQ community versus someone who's non-white. There may be these sort of subtle differences, but there are also likely some larger systematic pressures at play that are influencing all of them to some level. Now, they might need like individual targeted approaches to help bring everyone to a certain level of equity, but there are these bigger powers that be or systems at play that may intersect, because it is likely the same people who benefit from a kind of the class divide or kind of ensuring a class divide are probably also benefiting from a racial divide, or also benefiting from a sex divide, or also benefiting from an ableist divide, and that there may be something there to kind of tie it together.
I see.
one of the things, this is an article, I'll have to find it so we can post it if you're interested. It looked at the issue of male privilege and masculine privilege and kind of the intersections of, if you don't meet a particular threshold of manness, you no longer get the same benefits as men do, per se.
Right.
So like if you're a gay man, for example, you're already knocked down the hierarchy.
Right.
If you are disabled, you're knocked down the hierarchy. If age was another one, and there was also a class one too. So if you don't make a certain amount of money, or if you have problems providing for your family, and that kind of gets to that maleness of being a provider role, if you can't personally achieve that, then other men are going to push you down that hierarchy in order to elevate themselves. And so even within privileged groups themselves, there's still that hierarchy that, you know, you may be on one side of the divide that receives the privilege and some benefits, but there's also, like, it's not a great side to be on either, because you're constantly in group fighting for the top spot.
But no, it's not about. That is because people who are seen as not being the prototypical of the group, they're kind of betraying the group. They're violating the group. They're not like, they're violating the standard, right? So that's why there would be that type of oppression towards them.
Wish I could remember their names, but there is a paper that looks at when they looked at both men and women violating social norms and how both men and women viewed it. They found that men were far more harsher towards other men and women were far more harsher towards other women. At least if they scored high enough on like right-wing authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, and the like, is that you're violating the group, you're breaking away, and there's still that kind of system, that sort of systematic institution that is saying this is how men are, this is how women are, this is what you have to do to succeed. You know, you're going against that. You're violating the norms or the social structure.
Yeah, correct.
And maybe Thomas, this is in a way you're addressing Daniel's question about the intersectionality, right? Because like a gay man is not really a man. And I'm doing inverted commas for those.
No.
Quote unquote.
You know what I mean? Like it's, yes, because even in trying to uphold the like what's the best,
Right.
like again the best, like sarcastically said, if you take an intersectional approach, the men who don't fall in this example, who don't fall into the best category, right, they violate the standard because they have other characteristics or other group memberships that make them not being a true man.
Correct.
Yes. And even within, like, so like if you break down from men, you go down to gay men. I think it was my first study here, I looked at the difference between men who preferred like the insertive role in sex versus the receptive role in sex. And there's a prejudicial divide there too. And it's predicted by sexism and internalized heteronormative behaviors.
Right.
And so even within the category that isn't at the top, who aren't real men, there are also not real men,
Right.
And no one's, I mean, as long as you're kind of living within the system, you have the potential to be confronted. I mean, at least at the kind of prejudicial level. I remember the most awkward haircut I ever got was about 3-4 months after my son was born. And my hair is getting long now, but it was a little longer. And I remember the woman cutting my hair was like, "Oh, your hair is getting long." And I said, "Well, yeah, my son was born. I work. I haven't had a whole lot of time. Got stuff to do at home. Got this new kid." And she was like, "Well, that's not really an excuse you can make." And it was just a really awkward rest of that haircut while I just sort of sat there and I was like, "Really? Like, are we going to like talk about the nature of nurturing, like whether or not nurturing and being receptive towards your kid makes you a real man?" But that ties into that aspect that this is the prototypical aspect of what a man is, that 1950s, you know, Leave It to but at least Leave It to Beaver's dad offered wisdom. But, you know, providing for the home without necessarily having to engage in a lot of emotional support.
Mhm.
And if that
So you're
is kind of taken as that prototype, it becomes part of that system. I mean,
right.
that's ultimately too when we look at the was that research that looked at like sociopathy in CEOs, and not that like sociopaths necessarily become CEOs, but maybe even becoming a CEO and adopting those roles might make you a little more of a sociopath.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that about the example of the haircut, Daniel, she was saying, just because you had a kid, it's not a reason for you that is a man to not have a haircut, right?
Right.
Because you're not even taking care of your kid. You shouldn't be, because that's what she's assuming, that you should be doing the man thing.
Yeah, I had a student question me once when I said I'm going home and cooking dinner. And he was like, doesn't your wife do that? And I was like, I'm going to shut you down quick. I was like, first off, she's a strong, independent woman and she's got her own job. It's like, second off, I like to cook. Like, does that suddenly make me not a man? I was like, I'm going to go pick my kid up and we're going to go home and I'm going to cook and, you know,
Right.
do the, I guess, traditionally non-masculine duties.
Yeah,
But
great.
it's and I guess this can bridge us into our last topic of these cultural aspects of how we view what is acceptable, unacceptable, appropriate, inappropriate, moral, immoral.
Mhm.
And that also tie into both these kind of individual sense, but also, which is heavily implied in moral foundations theory, the institutional aspects of how our moral code, or what we view as our moral code, is structured. I don't know if someone wants to introduce moral foundations. I'm fairly well read up on, was it Graham and Haidt?
Natalia, you wanna?
Go ahead.
No. Do you wanna go ahead and do it?
Oh yeah, so moral foundations, we're basically saying exactly what Daniel said. That like there are some let's say things, attitudes, acts that in one culture, for example, might be considered completely normal and acceptable, but then that same thing in another culture is considered non-moral, right? So then we're talking about how the context will influence what we think it's right and wrong. So that's in a nutshell of moral foundations. Yeah.
Do you want to go over the 4 foundations?
5.
There are 5? Well, there were 5.
There are 5.
There are 5 factors.
With the libertarian now there are 6, but otherwise there are 5.
Well, I meant the kind of underlying, I guess, pillars, I think is the way they word them. Oh, there are 5 now. Okay.
Yes. Can you remind me of the list though?
Well, I'm not talking about like the care versus harm or.
Oh, right. Okay. Wow,
that's what you're talking about, right? There are 5.
No, I was talking about. I think in their original list, they kind of talk about these 4 kind of underlying facets. So, personal experience is one. Things like important individuals in your life, so parents, pastors. I think there's culture in general, and then maybe peers. I'm trying to remember all, because there are those 4, and then those influence how you view these. Yeah, the 6. They're now 6.
Yeah.
These kind of basic foundations. So, I'm going to try to remember them all. Care versus harm,
Yes.
Sanctity versus degradation. I'm being put on the spot.
Fairness and cheating. We
fairness
got it.
and cheating.
Yeah, loyalty. We already said that.
Purity.
Authority.
Yeah, authority versus
Subversion.
I guess subversion.
Loyalty and betrayal.
Mm-hmm. And then the new one's liberty and oppression.
Okay.
Right. So the idea here is that we would take either one side or well, it's a spectrum, obviously. Yes. So you're like more on one side or the other. For example, care and harm. Like, do I worry about people? Whenever I see something happening, do I consider who is being hurt as one of the primary things that I consider if this is right or wrong? And I love to give this example because in the book, it's the book for Moral Foundations. It's like the examples are like this. So there's this family and their dog just got hit by a car outside. They saw it. So they went outside, got the dog, cooked the dog, ate the dog. Nobody saw it. Look at that. The dog was dead, okay? So judge the family. This is the type of several scenarios that he had in the book. And then people are like, oh no, that's not moral, that's disgusting. And then whenever you start asking them why, and then the person, because it's disgusting. And then you go back to the idea of disgusting, but then like, what is it that nobody got hurt, right? Nobody saw it. It's not even like that.
The dog got hurt.
Right, the dog was already dead, right? This is the idea.
Yeah, the family isn't being judged on whether they killed the dog or not.
I know.
Right, exactly. And then there's even more, like this guy comes home and then he has sex with the chicken. So that's the dead chicken, okay? So like again, right? But then going back to a more like on a daily basis example is, for example, call your dad by the first name here in America and calling your dad by the first name in some other cultures that would be completely unacceptable. Another very good example that they give to is that this woman, she goes to the movies, she watches the movies, she comes home, the husband hits her, judge the husband. Okay, because she went by herself. Then you have cultures that will think the husband was helping her because he needs to let her understand that if she keeps going by herself to the movies, she's not going to go to whatever happens to you after you die in that culture, right? Like I'm teaching you how to be righteous. That's the idea, for example, over there. Or I'm saying over there, like I don't want to name the names, but like, some cultures that are more traditional or things like this, it will play out differently than you would here. And the same exactly thing, like kicking the dog, there isn't something about kicking a dog too, will be seen. There are some that are going to be seen as immoral no matter what, right? And then there are some that they would be in the line where some cultures would be okay with and some other cultures would not. Yeah.
It's important to know that these are all, a spectrum too. So,
right.
You get a list of possible care versus harm questions. So you could have someone who's like, we should house the homeless and we should make sure people are taken care of. But I'm all for the death penalty. And so you're not all the way on care. You're
right.
a little further towards harm because there are situations where you might find that it's justifiable. And that a lot of these factors are heavily influenced by culture and upbringing and information from again your parents and religious structures and systems that have a big influence. I think one of their biggest findings was looking at how political parties or people who identify as either liberal or conservative view, and we tend to find that liberals tend to view care versus harm really high in care. I think fairness and cheating is higher in fairness, right. But the others not so much. So the things like authority versus subversion, little towards subversion, a willingness to break away from that authority, which, even if we're getting into the philosophical structure of what liberalism and conservatism means, it makes sense. Liberalism, more about change, conservatism, more about tradition. Whereas with conservatism, they're kind of high in all of them. So sanctity is really important, authority is really important, loyalty is really important. But so is careness or care and fairness. But we see these differences in that while all are really important or tend to score high for conservative individuals, we see kind of two of the five being far more important for liberal individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that this conversation is interesting if we bring it back to the beginning of our conversation of like how do we talk about intergroup relations when apparently, based on the moral foundations theory, we have different morals, right? So how can we, and especially in the society we're living right now in the United States, right? We see such a divided society along religious lines, along political lines. So how can we bridge that gap if we take the moral foundations theory at its face value, saying that we miscommunicate. We cannot because we believe that different things are what's make things moral.
Correct. Yes, that's the point right there.
And that especially when we look at I think the moral foundations of things like authority versus subversion, loyalty, maybe even views of fairness in terms of if you have an unjust law or a system that is unjustly harming a particular subset of, let's say, American people, but you're really high in viewing authority as this important thing, or you know, following the law means being fair, despite the fact that maybe the law isn't fair.
Right.
That it can break down some of these discussions, because the hang up isn't about care or maybe even about fairness, it's about authority, because maybe that's the moral that the individual is maybe more hyper focused on.
In the sense that it's the rule, so it's the law, so I have to follow it. I'm not the one that makes the law, so if it's the law, I'm following it, period. Yes. Not me, in this sense, you know, the person that thinks like that.
And it's also kind of an uphill battle too, because if we want to talk about institutional influences on the individual, like if we go back to, you know, race as a construct being a justification for capitalism and oppression to begin with, that's constantly being reinforced by the same institutions to this day. So like, it's one thing to say people are miscommunicating about, you know, like, oh, you're a racist. Oh, I take that as a personal attack. No, it was a systematic attack. Well, that person probably watches a lot of, or receives a lot of information from institutions that remind them that it's a personal attack, or that the country is burning down, or that, you know, other groups are to blame for their problems, and that further divides us. So it's not like we're working on a clean slate without any bad actors in this conversation either.
Yeah, and I also know that there are a lot of criticisms to the moral foundation theory, right? Some are kind of about the theorizing, some are about how it holds up across different cultural spaces and so forth. And just to give credit to the people who do the moral foundations, they acknowledge all of these things. But I don't know, I on a personal level, I struggle with that a lot, because when I discovered this theory, I thought, oh, great, let's, in all of my classes, the first day of class, let's read one article on that. Let's discuss it and kind of try to work through why we might not agree, right? Yeah, but then what? Then what? Like, that leads to kind of that conversation of like, well, my morals are my morals, your morals are your morals, and we come from different places. So we'll just agree to disagree. And that's, I was about to use a bad word, and that is not okay.
What's the term that gets, I think, lumped into that concept too? And I think moral foundations might help reinforce the concept, even though I don't think it maybe does. Is this like cultural relativism? The idea of, at least that some people argue that we're kind of taking, well, this culture does it, so we have to be accepting, or this culture, you know, maybe has a really extreme aspect, but because of these moral differences, but that might kind of, you know, again, get us into this sort of muddied concept of we've been talking about.
Although oh my gosh, I appreciate you bringing up cultural relativism, because when Natalia was talking about the examples of the dog being killed and the family ate it, and the sex with the chicken and whatnot, right? I mean, it definitely falls into that notion of cultural relativism. And that's, again, on a personal level, and I oftentimes bring that in my classes as well, is I do consider myself a cultural relativist. And I think, Natalia, probably you do too. And I think it's a function of not growing up in the US and coming from different cultures and realizing that different cultures function differently and value different things. And
Definitely.
Yes, on the other hand, though, I would say when it comes to things like oppression, when it comes to things like treatment of women and whatnot, I'm not cultural relativist, right? So I struggle with that a lot, and I want my students to struggle with it as well. Like, how do you decide? Like, how is there a middle point? Is there not, right? How do you
question it? Yes. No, don't just say no, but question it. At least don't just see something. That's one of the things that I told my students. I said, if you're living here today, like last class, at least questioning things. Once you read them, you read like I don't know, a title of something, and if you at least think about it, I did something here, right? Instead of just saying that's right immediately, right? Like just consider some stuff. Just think about it, right? Struggle with it, because there is no easy answer, right?
And also,
I
one of
mean-
the things that, at least for me personally, deals with cultural relativism and kind of like, where are my lines of like, I'm not relativistic about this, is trying to make sure that I'm not being colonial
Mhm.
with the things that I'm not
Right.
relativistic on.
Right.
Because there is a long history of, you know, like, this is the right thing to do, and we're going to implement that and advocate for that across all cultures regardless. And so trying to balance between like, okay, like this thing is a fact, this is what I believe in, and this should be true regardless of culture, but also like trying to balance that between like, am I just projecting my own culture onto another one as well,
Mhm.
when it shouldn't be.
I had a research design paper which I really tried to shift in an opposite direction. This was years ago, but it was on how moral relativism is destroying society, and I was like, no, you can't. But it was very written in, it was written in that way, and it was an entire semester of trying, and I don't think I was very successful, but trying to help the student understand, like, you're viewing this from a very particular moral viewpoint, and that moral viewpoint is very white Christian moral viewpoint. And so there are ways to maybe look at this, that maybe a true 100% is maybe some alarmist might try to call it in terms of moral relativism, is probably not a good thing. And there might be a way to look at that in terms of a research proposal. But by saying that anything that doesn't kind of fit this strict moral white Christian 1950s mentality is kind of degrading things. I mean, it makes me think too of like, when we think about relativism, with our discussion, we talked about cults, is that you know, there's this distinction: is that infringing or removing someone's basic rights, their ability to kind of be, and again, that can become a very difficult question as to, well, what are our basic rights?
Yeah.
It's also tied to cultural upbringing, how we view our morals. Just think about free speech in the United States versus even in places like France that don't have the same freedom of speech laws that we have, and how they might view that, and that these institutions affect the way that we view the world, or view, you know, our environments. And to get back to individual versus institutional prejudice, ultimately can impact how we view, you know, others. The institutional laws that are in place. I remember there was a Louisiana law, still, it was completely unconstitutional, but there were police still rounding up. They were basically putting out advertisements for relationships, and when a guy would show up to meet with someone for a same-sex relationship, the police would arrest them, would bring them down to the station, would hold them for the weekend, and then go, oh, we can't constitutionally charge you with anything, so we're going to let you go. And it was unconstitutional. They were spending, the Baton Rouge Police Department was spending thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars running these sting operations, because it was still technically a law on the books still, but again, tied to these, you know, if you grow up in an environment where that's on the books, that's the institution, that's the law, that's the legality, it can drastically change your perspective of someone who violates that law.
And even within the gay circles, it promotes that hierarchical in-group fighting, because you don't want to be perceived as one of those gays that would get picked up by the police because you're too effeminate, or that you're too promiscuous, that you need to like maintain this very like straight man monogamous lifestyle, and like people don't need to know about your sexuality. And that leads to all sorts of issues revolving around like risky sexual behavior, and like men getting into heterosexual relationships and cheating on their wives because they have to hide this, otherwise there's real consequences to that behavior.
Yes, what comes to my mind with this conversation is, just by doing that, right, then you're already showing, quote unquote, society or the culture what you believe, right, about this specific group here. So I'm picking you up and I'm taking you to jail, so therefore you must be bad, right? So I think it goes with what you're saying too, because then you have these other layers of, I guess, oppression that would count towards if you are like, for example, more feminine or whatever it is, right?
Yeah. Do we have a bias of the week?
We do have a bias of the week. We forgot this. Eva has not, I don't know, necessarily been inducted to the bias of the week.
I have no clue.
We skipped it. So we have this big list of biases, and every podcast we pick a bias. I usually try to find something that's loosely related to what we're talking about. But I think this kind of fits if we're talking about morals and, maybe some people wanting to go back to a particular moral set, maybe reverse some changes that had happened. It's Mitchell and Thompson, 94, Rosy, Retrospection, the tendency for people to remember events as being better than they really were at the time of their occurrence.
Make America great again.
I wasn't going to say it.
I'll say it.
I wasn't going to say it. That's great.
But looking at things like that, we can say that, what we've been talking about with moral foundations, that as we do see maybe laws change, decisions made, systems being challenged over time, you can see improvements. Our acceptance of interracial marriage has changed drastically since 1973,
right.
With the Loving case. And I would argue that we'll see how things pan out in the next couple of years, but the same-sex marriage decision as another example, that perceptions have changed. I mean, they haven't changed completely, and they haven't changed everywhere, but we are seeing a trend, especially in again, if you grow up in an environment where it's not questioned as much, or it's legal, you're more likely to see it, you're more likely to be exposed to it. It can affect some of those foundations, some of the kind of underlying beliefs that you have. And if we're getting back to that individual versus institution.
Right. Daniel, I agree. It brings me to one thing that I heard this professor, lawyer, philosopher in Brazil. Is this, he's Black, and he was talking about how racism, it's not me coming here into this room and then people throwing rocks at me. It's like me coming into this room and people getting surprised that I'm who I am after they introduce me, right? So one of the things that was really interesting that he said, because he got to one of those moments that he's like, how do we answer this, right? And then he said something like we kind of talk about today, we did, but different words. It's this constant learning, right? He was saying there is no vacation, there is no time that I'm like, okay, I took this training and now I'm good. I learned everything about not how to not be racist or whatever, so it's because we know it's a system, and that the system is, we are embedded in this whole cycle, right? So it's a constant work for us to keep trying to break those attachments that we have with certain thoughts throughout life. It's not like we do it and then now I'm done, right? Because it's a system, it's still there. So that's how the little by little will change if we continue to seek to get free from those prejudices,
Daniel, the bias that you brought up, it just made me think of like, so 20 years down the line, I would think, well, the pandemic wasn't that bad, right? But the downside to it is like the US response wasn't that bad. When in reality, I want 20 years from now to remember how bad that response was.
I mean, think of how people are referring to Bush versus...
Yeah.
Well, in comparison.
Well, I mean, I think comparison, social comparison plays a huge role, but again, like some of the aspects of laws that were passed, things that were done, I mean, yeah, we're still living with some of that stuff, or a lot of that stuff, but there's that. I've got this, and I'm fine throwing it out there because I don't think it'll ever get written, but I've had this book idea for, I don't know, 15 years, just called The World Was Always Awful. And I want to get this interdisciplinary approach of getting a bunch of people to write about just different aspects. So let's just write a kind of historical synopsis of sexism and saying, look, we don't want to make an argument like that things are perfect, but we want to make an argument that like going back to, let's say, the 1800s, because it was so much of a better time, or idolizing knights, you know, running around like that would be great. Like, no, like there's no internet. There's no,
Yes.
there's also a lot of, you know, disease and a lot of other things that we take for granted. You know, but even, you know, going back 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and saying like where we are now is like, we need work, but going back to that is not necessarily the best way to go. Or
Like there was no great in the past. That's what you're saying. It's like there is no great to go back to.
we've been advancing. We
Yes.
advance as a species. We advance as culture. I mean, there might be aspects that we can look at. I mean, there certainly are things that certain cultures and certain civilizations have had that are a much better outlook than we would look at today. I was talking with my class, you know, concerning like social perception of transgender individuals, and how you look at like the Native American view of the twin soul, and one of them actually being able to offer some of that perspective because she's Native American or First Nations, that there's, you know, again, like that is a much better outlook than maybe we have. I was like, but we can incorporate it into our current outlook as opposed to maybe going back to everything that existed, you know, in the 1800s.
Yeah.
So at some point, I'm going to get together with a bunch of people and do an editorial called "The World Was Always Awful."
Sign me up.
Okay.
Sign me up.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I think, I don't know. Does anyone have any last thoughts? Any last comments?
Oh, I think that was great.
I think we were very thorough.
I mean, as thorough as we can be in like an hour and a half, because there's so much to unpack with this topic. It's always, I never feel I could lecture on it for 2 weeks and I never feel like I've covered enough.
Yeah.
I never feel like I've talked about enough. You need classes, but again, it's that ongoing process.
Yes, they will. I teach a class on stereotyping and prejudice for a semester, and it's not enough. I just there's so much they can read. There's no time.
And so with that, we'll put some resources in the description. We'll try to get as much of that, you know, at least a start for everyone. And I guess with that, goodbye.
Yes,
Bye.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.